All right. Well, welcome to tonight's class. Tonight's class, we're going to be going over the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. I'm going to go over it page by page, paragraph by paragraph to explain it, so that way you know how to explain it when you're presenting it to a client, and also what to fill in the appropriate spaces. So before we get into that, just when you have a client that's ready to list their home, you're of course going to want to first present to them the working with real estate agents disclosure, and then next, once they've decided they're ready to list their home and you've done a pre-listing appointment and they have decided they want to hire you as their agent, that's when you will bring out the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. And the exclusive right sell to listing agreement is Form 101. So starting at the top, we have this listing agreement is an agreement between seller and listing firm. So in the seller line, of course, you put the seller. Now in the blue box below that, it tells you is the seller possibility it could be someone different per the tax records, as if someone may have passed. Now it may be in probate or an estate, or the seller may be an LLC, an S Corp, or the seller could be a number of people. If there is a married couple, even if one of the spouses is not on the deed, unless they have signed like a prenuptial agreement or some other type of agreement relinquishing someone's rights to the property. In North Carolina, 1 to buy, 2 to sell. So both parties in the marriage would have to sign. So before you know who the seller is, you just want to verify you have the appropriate people and all the people listed as sellers, so that way you get all of the appropriate signatures. Next, going down, talk about term of the agreement. And the term of the agreement would be, when is the effective date? Is the effective date once all parties have signed this? Or is the effective date once a current listing agreement with another firm expires? So if the seller is already under contract as far as a listing agreement with another firm, you can still sign this with that seller, but the effective date cannot be until the date that the current one expires. And it's in bold that states that the seller acknowledges that the effective date cannot be prior to the expiration of a current listing agreement, and they have received the working with real estate agents disclosure. So you depict, is the effective date the date that this is signed by all parties, or the termination of a current one? Next is the expiration. Expiration, very important. It has to have an expiration date on it per commission guidelines. So what expiration date are you putting on here? Have you agreed with your seller to do a 3-month listing, a 6-month listing, or a year listing? You cannot do a listing longer than a year. That just changed this year from the commission. A listing agreement cannot be longer than 365 days. You can renew it after a year for another year, but you can't have a listing longer than a year, and it cannot be open-ended. Next, the property. So here's where you will put the address, the city, the state, the zip code, and the county. All of that information, if you don't know it, can be found in the tax records. And then on the bottom of this page, just like every other page, you as the listing agent representing the firm and the sellers will initial the bottom of every page. Moving on to page 2. The top of page 2 talks about other descriptions of the property. What is the lot unit number, the block section, subdivision? All this information can be found in the tax records. The things in this that are most commonly used, which we usually put in all of our listing agreements, would be the subdivision, if it is in a subdivision, the parcel ID, the PID number or PIN, the parcel ID number, and then under legal description under other description is where you would put the legal description. And then the deed book and page. The deed book and page is also located in the tax records near the bottom under recent sales. If this home has transferred hands 3 or 4 times, each time the house sells, there will be a different deed book and page number. So when you write in the deed book and page number, you want to make sure you're finding the deed book and page that correlates with the current owner. So that way you have the correct deed book and page. Next, section number 3, moving into fixtures and exclusions. Now in the blue box here, it states, and we will cover this as we talk about fixtures and exclusions, but this part of the listing agreement is also in the offer to purchase. Now, if you have fixtures that are included or excluded in the listing agreement and they are not in the offer to purchase contract, then they are not included or excluded. The offer to purchase will trump the listing agreement on anything that is in the listing agreement and on the offer to purchase. So when filling this out, if the listing has fixtures and exclusions, you want to make sure those are filled in on the offer to purchase when you receive one. So, red box. Parties should not assume that an item will be included in the sale or excluded without written acknowledgement. So do not assume that things will be included or excluded. Make sure if they are concerned about it, make sure it is written out. Section B, all the bullet points. All of these bullet points are examples of items that would convey with the sale of a home. All of these items are going to need to convey with the sale of the home unless notated and written out and agreed upon with all parties. Examples of some of these, are alarm fobs, garage door fobs, house keys. Some of these things seem kind of strange as to why they're in there, like floors. The floors have to stay with the home. Trees, your windows, your doors, the mailbox. Things like that you would assume would be just normally left with the home, but all these things are added because I assure you somewhere down the line, someone sold their home and decided to take that stuff with them. If it is built in to the home, nailed in, or structured to be part of the home, then it should convey with the sale of the home, unless otherwise notated. Bottom of this page, unpairing and deleting data from devices. Example of that is a Ring camera. When you sell a home, the seller needs to unpair from that camera and delete any previous footage, clips, photos, information from that device, so when the new buyer takes over, the seller cannot access those cameras and the buyer doesn't have access to previously recorded footage from when the seller owned it. So make sure that is also addressed. Going on, next section, items leased or not owned. On the top of page 3, items leased or not owned. What would classify something like this? If your seller is selling a home and they have lease purchased all of their kitchen appliances, that would be an item that would go on to here. An appliance is supposed to convey with the home. If the seller does not own it because they are still leasing it, that's where you would put that in here. And if that's the case and they are conveying with the home, seller needs to understand that they are going to pay these off prior to or at closing. Another example that is most common in today's world is solar panels. A lot of sellers will get solar panels and they have payments on them till they're paid off. Well, when the buyer buys the home, those solar panels need to be paid off in full by the seller unless agreed upon with buyer and seller. If not agreed upon, seller needs to understand that need to have those paid off. Next would be items that do not convey. What would be a fixture that is supposed to come with the house that the seller is taking with them? So any of the bullet pointed items the seller has the right to take. Just if they do, we want to notate it so we can let our buyers know, if you purchase this home, the chandelier in the dining room is not conveying with the home. Seller wants to take that. It's a sentimental chandelier or something else that may be built in. If they're taking the microwave, if they want to take that microwave, then you need to notate it. If a seller wants to take a microwave, I would strongly advise to them, you are welcome to take it, but let's go ahead and remove it and possibly replace it with something else so that way it's not part of the site when the buyer comes through. Anything that a seller is wanting to take with them when they sell the home, we want to try, if possible, to recommend to them, let's go ahead and take it down or remove it, so that way when a buyer comes through the house, They don't see it, they don't know about it, just makes things a little bit more streamlined and easier throughout the selling process. If that's not possible, then just make sure it is notated in the listing and all buyers know that if you were to purchase this home, these items will not be conveying with the sale. Next, number 4, personal property. Is there any personal property that is conveying with the home? Examples of personal property, the most common ones would be refrigerator, washer, and dryer. Those 3 major appliances are considered personal property. They do not have to convey with the sale, and a lot of times sellers may be taking those, but if not, if the seller is willing to leave them at no additional cost to the buyer, that would be a line that those would be filled in. Same thing is if there is, for example, say a seller is selling an Airbnb home that's fully furnished. The seller may be selling it fully furnished. So here you may put all furniture, bedding, everything, the house is being sold fully furnished. That may be an example of something that may go into that line. If the seller is leaving personal property and it's in this listing agreement and the buyer wants to make sure they get it, so they want to have it in the offer to purchase, before they put it in the offer to purchase, buyer needs to consult with their lender. A lot of times lenders will not allow personal property to convey as part of the contract per loan standards. So want to make sure if that is going to be an issue, buyer still wants it, then example to get around that is put it into a bill of sale. Outside of the offer to purchase, lender does not need to see that bill of sale. It can be a bill of sale from buyer to seller at a cost to buyer of $0. So that way we have a written document stating that these items are conveying to the buyer at no cost, and we're not going to run into any loan issues as far as that goes. A way to cross that bridge. Next, moving down to section number 5, home warranty. Does the seller want to offer a home warranty up front? If so, what is the price that the seller is willing to offer a home warranty up to? Is it $500? Is it $800? $1,000? What is it? And if they are offering one, there is a line for a fee. Are we, as the list agent, charging the seller a fee to set up this home warranty that will be offered to a buyer at closing? Now, this is totally up to your seller. Does your seller want to offer a home warranty up front? Or does your seller not want to offer one and then wait and see if a buyer asks for one? It is totally up to the seller. The sellers a lot of times are going to ask you, should I offer one or should I not? Well, we can't really tell you what you should and should not do in the sale of your home. We can just let you know, here's your options. You can offer one up front, and it might be appealing to a buyer. If you don't want to offer one up front now, but you're willing to give one to a buyer, then maybe we don't offer it up front and see if a buyer asks for one. And if they ask for one, then we may be gladly to supply one. Totally up to the seller, but either way, whatever they choose, make sure you check. Next, moving on to section number 6, listing price. Big one. Sellers always want to know what they're selling their house for. What are we listing the house for? That will go into listing price. And then next to that is what terms are we accepting? Are we accepting cash, FHA, VA, USDA, conventional loan, loan assumption, seller financing, or other? We need to make sure we check any of the appropriate boxes. Now, if we were to check FHA and offer FHA and then find out that FHA is now not applicable or it may not go FHA, then at that time we need to remove FHA as a possibility because we've learned that it may not go. But just because we check it and offer it does not guarantee a buyer that we would be able to close that type of loan. That's the type of loan that we are willing to entertain. Now, before you check those boxes, you want to make sure that your list price is below the cap of FHA. I don't remember off the top of my head what the cap is For FHA, it went up. I want to say it's like 560 something, somewhere around there. But you can find that out from the lender. Same thing with VA. You know, you want to make sure that the VA isn't capped. And in order for a person to qualify for VA, they can only have one VA loan outstanding at a time. So if they already have a property under VA, they would either have to sell that property or refinance it, take the VA benefits away before they can apply for another VA loan. USDA. USDA is 100% financing. How do you find out if a home qualifies USDA? Is you would go to the USDA website and look up the USDA qualifying map. Put the home's address into it and it'll tell you there. Is it in the shaded area that qualifies for USDA or not? If it is in that area, then it qualifies USDA and we can now accept USDA. Conventional, any home pretty much qualifies for conventional. There's not a cap because once you get to a certain price point, then you just become what's called a jumbo loan, conventional loan, which is, you know, high dollar, but conventional can be about anything. Cash, everyone's gonna accept cash. And then there is loan assumption. Are we allowing the buyer to assume the loan that is in place? If you are wanting to possibly go down that avenue, you're going to have to confirm with the the seller's lender that the loan is assumable. And then next is seller financing. Is your seller willing to seller finance the property to a buyer? If they are willing to do that, before you'd accept that, you want them to talk to an attorney and an accountant just to go over, make sure they know what they're getting into prior to doing that. And then is there any other loan terms that we would be willing to accept? Sorry, we had somebody outside trying to get in the wrong door. Next, once we have that, we have firm's compensation. What fee are we charging the seller to list and sell their home? So that fee, you know, we try to get all of our residential listings at 6% as a firm, which we would take 3%, and then we'd be offering 3% to a buyer's agent. Now, we all know that commission is negotiable, so if that were to change, you know, we have the forms that we present to our seller as far as what we're offering and accepting, but that is where you would put the fee. Now, the fee you put there is the total commission that you would be charging the seller, not just 3% to you, but you'd also, if they're paying a buyer's agent, what are they paying that agent? Because we need to put all that into this number. If it is not a percentage, if it's a flat fee or whatever other compensation it may be, that would go in the line below that. Now next is fee earned, fee due, and payable. Your fee is earned when you bring a willing, ready, and able buyer that is able to purchase and close on the home with the terms set forth in here and agreed upon the seller. Now, when is that fee due and payable? That fee is due and payable at closing, or if the seller breaches the contract. If the seller were to materially breach the contract and you have done your job, in theory, you are still owed your commission and you could still collect on that commission. But majority of the times it is due and payable at closing when the home sells. All right, next page. We're going to transfer of interest in business entity. So what does that paragraph mean? Is the seller a partnership, a corporation, or a business entity? Now, if that is the case and the seller were to transfer their ownership, whether it be a merger with another company or some type of deal they had within their company or another company, if that were to happen, you would still be owed your commission, and it would not necessarily be based off of the value of the transfer or the takeover, because that may not be full value if that happens. So your commission now is based off of a percentage of the original commission off of a fair market value of that property. So if that is the case, you know, talk with your manager or myself can walk you through that one if that is going to be a concern. Next is additional compensation. If you were to accept any additional compensation as a list agent, you cannot accept it without written consent from your seller. So if a buyer is willing to offer you compensation as well, you cannot accept that unless it is signed off and acknowledged by all parties. All right, next, cooperating in compensation with other firms. Are we cooperating in paying compensation to other firms or agents? Are we compensating sub-agents? Are we compensating buyer agents? Or will we compensate with other cooperating real estate firms? If you are, you will check the boxes. And then to the right of that, what is the compensation that we are offering to them? Is it 1%, 2%, 3%, whatever it may be, whatever we'd have agreed upon with our seller is what we will put in those lines. If you have any questions while I'm going through this, please let me know. Just below that, in bold letters, seller has to initial. And this initial lets the seller know that the seller understands that they are under no obligation to pay a buyer's agent's commission. If they want to pay it, they are welcome to, but they are under no obligation to do it, and it is negotiable. So they acknowledge and initial there that they have been made aware that they do not have to pay it. There is pros and cons depending on which way they go, but they do not have to pay it, and they acknowledge that they understand that. Next, we're going into firm's duties. What are the firm's duties when selling a home? First is best efforts to find a buyer. The agent will be representing the firm, and they will be doing the firm's duties in their best efforts to find a buyer. Disclosure of material terms of offer. Next section. Now, a list agent, we are not obligated and we cannot disclose material terms of an offer we have received to other potential buyers. We will disclose those terms to our seller, of course, but we cannot disclose any material terms of any offer to anybody other than our seller without written permission of the party that made that offer. That's what that paragraph states. Next is disclosure of material facts. Now, as an agent, we are required to disclose all material facts to all interested parties, no matter what that material fact is. If our seller wants us to not disclose material facts, we still have to disclose them, no matter what our seller instructs us as far as that goes, because that is part of our code of ethics that we have to follow. So we have to let our sellers know if we as list agents learn of any material facts about the home, we have to disclose that to all potential buyers. Next is other professional services. Seller acknowledges that they may want to talk to other people when they're selling or trying to sell their home. Examples of that may be CPA. They may want to get their home inspected. They may need to have an appraisal before they list their home to find their own value. If they want to talk with those types of professional services, we will gladly recommend them to our sellers, but our seller understands that we are not held responsible for their job. If they were to be hired to do something and the seller was dissatisfied with their work, that is really no reflection on us because we didn't do their job. We just recommended a position for them to consult with. Next, providing agreement to listing service. Now, we are required to put all of our listings that are publicly marketed into a listing service, i.e. the MLS. And sometimes the MLS or our listing service may ask to see a copy of the listing agreement. If they do, we have to furnish it to them. And this acknowledges to the seller that if we are required to share our listing agreement with the listing service, we will do so. All right, moving on to page 5. Top of page 5 in big bold letters. Agent and firm shall conduct all brokerage activities without discriminating against any protected class. We cannot discriminate against any protected class. Next, big red box. Buyer letters to seller. Sometimes buyers will write a personal letter to the seller, trying to persuade the seller to accept their offer. Now, we cannot present that letter to the seller if it includes protected class information. So if we receive a letter that says, me and my family, me and my spouse, me and my handicapped child, anything like that, those are all protected classes. We cannot present those letters to our seller. Because why? Because it could be made possibility that the seller might take an offer or not take an offer if they were to learn something about a buyer that is of a protected class. And we can't have that. So if a buyer presents a letter and it has anything like that in it, we have to politely tell the buyer's agent and the buyer, thank you for the letter, but we cannot present it to our seller the way it is written because it contains protected class information. Next, initial. Seller will initial that they have been made aware of the firm's duties described above. Next, we're going on to marketing. Commencement of marketing. What is the marketing date? What date is the seller allowing us to start marketing their home? Is it the day that we get all this signed, or do they not want marketing to start for a week or a month, whatever it may be? But what date? You need to put a hard date in there, not in 7 days. You want to put January 15th. That way we know exactly what date that is. Marketing authorization. There's two options here, one on page 5 and one at the top of page 6. Are we doing public marketing or office exclusive marketing? First, with public marketing. Public marketing means that the seller gives us permission to market this home to the masses, to the public, to everyone, which is always a better option because you're going to get it in front of more people, more buyers, have a better chance of getting better offers. Now, once that public marketing takes place, does the seller authorize coming soon advertising? Are we doing the listing as coming soon? If you are, have you attached the coming soon Canopy MLS addendum to this listing agreement? If you are doing coming soon, there is a coming soon addendum that has to be signed by you and the seller. And that states that we are doing a coming soon listing. And in the coming soon status, the listing agent, the seller, buyer's agents, buyers, nobody can tour the home, show the home, or open the home up for visitors during that coming soon status. Next is signs. Does the seller authorize you to put for sale, under contract, sale pending, closing, all these different signs in their yard or at their home while you're selling it? If they acknowledge it and allow it, you also need to verify that there are no covenants or restrictions with the HOA that would prevent signage from going up. Next, open houses. Does your seller allow you to hold the house open? The next two, advertising other than on the internet and internet advertising. Does your seller allow you to advertise on the internet? And does the seller allow you to advertise in media outside of the internet? Example of that might be a magazine, newspaper, flyers, things like that would be advertising other than the internet. And then internet advertising, I feel, is pretty self-explanatory, putting it out on the internet. All right. Next, if you don't do public marketing, then you would do office exclusive. Office exclusive means you're only marketing the home to your office. Now, back on public marketing, when you do public marketing or office exclusive marketing, you may be required to put it in the MLS within 1 day of it being marketed. If you public market it, it is required to go into the MLS within 1 day of you marketing it publicly. If you do office exclusive, depending on the MLS's rules, you still may have to put it in the MLS, not necessarily as publicly marketed, but as what's called a comp sale. So that way it goes into the MLS as a comp sale to show that it is marketed. Now, per our office and per our MLS policies that we have set in place, all of our listings will go into the MLS unless the seller has explicitly written and signed a form stating they want it withheld from the MLS. If they do not sign off on that, we will put all of our listings in the MLS. Now, if we have that signed saying they explicitly prohibit us from putting it in the MLS, then we need to send that to Canopy MLS and the commission to notate so they know we have a listing, but we were instructed not to put it in the MLS, so that way we can't get in trouble for not putting it in the MLS. All right. Next, lock boxes and keys. Does the seller allow us to put a lock box on the home so ourselves and other agents can access the home when they would like to tour it? Yes or no? Next is seller acknowledgement. Seller acknowledges that with the lockbox, with advertising, with internet advertising, with pictures, photos, they acknowledge that it is possible that there could be unauthorized use or inappropriate use from the lockbox, from pictures, from internet. There could be someone who could be maliciously trying to advertise a home for sale for rent when it's not for rent. It is known that these things can happen, and we want to make our seller aware that it is a possibility. Now, as an agent, we will do everything in our power to make sure that does not happen. But we as list agents and people, we can't control everything in the world, no matter how hard we try. But if something does happen and is brought to our attention, we will do our best to fix it, and make sure it is taken down and fixed. But it is a possibility that it could happen. Moving on down, big red box. As a seller, it is under law illegal for a seller to listen to oral recordings of a buyer talking about the house in their home. Now, if a seller has cameras, you want to make sure you bring this up to your seller. You can turn the video on. You are allowed to watch the video, but you are not allowed to listen. You can only listen if you have written permission from the people you are listening to. All right, it is against the law for your sellers to listen to oral conversations of buyers talking about their possibility of an offer, because that could make negotiating very one-sided. If the seller already knows what a buyer is willing to pay, willing to offer for the home, the seller already knows that, it takes away any negotiating power for the buyer. So make sure your seller understands they cannot listen. Next, we're getting into earnest money and due diligence fee. Earnest money. Does the listing firm hold earnest money? Our firm does. So our firm can hold earnest money deposits for a contract. We have a trust account that we hold them in, so we can hold earnest money. The due diligence fee. We have to acknowledge right here on this listing agreement, who will the due diligence fee be made out to? Will it be made out to the seller, or will it be made out to another party or parties? This is brand new to listing agreement this past year. This was brought in because you may have sellers who are selling, and we want to make sure we acknowledge that the due diligence fee is made out to the appropriate seller or sellers. Is it made out to all sellers? Is it made out to one seller? Is it made out to the entity? Is it made out to the estate? What name does that due diligence fee need to be made out to? It's also been put into place because if you have a divorcing couple and they're selling the home, we need to make sure that both parties know, is the due diligence fee being made out to both or just one or the other? And that way all parties know, so we know when a due diligence fee comes in, who's that made out to. Next is seller representation. How has the seller owned this property? Have they owned it for at least 1 year, less than 1 year, or do they not yet own it? We need to make sure we check one of those three boxes. The first two are pretty self-explanatory. Has the seller owned it for at least 1 year, or has the seller owned it for less than 1 year? Next is, does the seller not yet own it? How would a seller be selling a home if they do not even own the home? That would be what's called an assignment. If they have got the house under contract with the owner and now they are selling that contract to a buyer. That would be an example of the seller does not yet own. Are they doing an assignment? If that is the case, as a buyer, you want to make sure that that assignment is legal and in place, because you want to make sure that that seller who's doing the assignment, even though they are doing the assignment and not yet owns the home, they have the right to sell that home in that contract. Moving on to bankruptcy. Is the seller under bankruptcy, or is the seller contemplating going into bankruptcy? Yes or no? If they are, that is a material fact. So that would have to be disclosed to any potential buyer. Next, access. Is the property have public road access, or is it private? If it is privately maintained road access, is there an agreement in place stating the maintenance of that private road or access? Next, manufactured mobile home. Is there a manufactured mobile home on the property? Whether that be the home for sale or just another mobile home that's on the property. If so, what is the VIN number and the year, model, etc.? Any information you may be able to get about that, you want to put that in here, because that will have to be notated with the lender, and also may have to have something come from the DMV to make sure that that title has been surrendered and it becomes real property and it's able to transfer ownership. Next, letter E, Owners Association. Is there an HOA with the property? If so, you want to get all the information you possibly can from the seller. Who the HOA is, who's the president, who's the contact information. More information that would be filled out about this would also be on the property disclosures that we will cover in another class. But that will depict, it'll state, what is the dues, how often are the dues paid, are there any confirmed or proposed special assessments? If so, what are they? Are there any transfer fees, anything like that? But right here's where you will put, is there an HOA, yes or no? If there is, who is the HOA president and the managing company? Next, is the seller a foreign person as far as defined by the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act? What does this paragraph state? Is your seller a foreign person? And if so, if they're purchasing real property in the United States, they can still do that. But if they are not covered under this act, depending on the status of them, they may have to withhold tax money at closing for the purchase of that property. Now, if you have someone who is not a legal U.S. citizen trying to purchase real estate prior to going under contract or selling it, you would be recommended to talk with an attorney to figure out the ramifications there. But is the seller a foreign person? Because if so, money may have to be held at closing for taxes. Next, receipt of sample forms. Has your seller received a sample copy of the offer to purchase and the professional services disclosure and election? Both of those need to be presented to a seller, either at the time of signing this so you can go over it with them, or prior to so they have time to review it. Those forms do not have to be filled out. They just have to be provided sample copies to the seller. That's all that part acknowledges. Next is flood hazard, wetlands, and flood insurance disclosure. Is the property that is being sold partially or all located in a flood zone? Yes or no? Is it affected by any water or riparian issues? And if so, is the seller required to maintain flood insurance, and do they have flood insurance? Last, on page 7, is synthetic stucco. Does the home have synthetic stucco? If so, then we want to have probably some type of inspection done on that synthetic stucco, because that is going to be a huge material fact that any buyer is going to want to be made aware of if the home has synthetic stucco. All right, moving on, page 8. Termite bond. Is there a termite bond on the home? Now, what is a termite bond? A termite bond is basically almost like a pest insurance, where you have a termite company that maintains the termite remediation treatment, and they have a bond on that. So if there ever is termites or damage from termites, they will cover the treatment and repairs of that if it ever comes. If so, if there is one, is it transferable to the new buyer? Current liens. Are there any liens or encumbrances on the property that is being sold? Whether it is a mortgage, a second mortgage, a HELOC, home equity line of credit, anything like that. Are there any of those? If so, we need to know about them, because they will have to be paid off at closing unless assumed by the buyer. And again, anything like that can happen as long as all parties agree and the loan is assumable to the buyer. So are there any liens? If so, please depict those, because it states, that a seller will have to pay off all these liens at or prior to closing. And is there any type of lien or anything that would result the seller not being able to sell the home? Are there any tax liens? Are they behind on any of these liens? Are they in delinquency? Anything like that we need to be made aware about and notate that in these lines, so we can try to get information about that so we can appropriately disclose it to potential buyers. All right, next, leases. Leases can make a big impact when selling a home. Is there a lease in place? Not only is there a lease, is there a tenant? Sometimes we may have tenants with no leases. So we need to make sure we're made aware of that. If there is a lease, we are going to want a copy of that for our records, and also we will want a copy of that because if we have a serious buyer, they may want to review that lease prior to going under contract or making an offer. So we want to make sure we have that available and make sure the seller understands that buyers may want to look at it and make sure that they're okay with us sharing it. If there is a lease, is there a property manager? Is there a property manager other than the seller that is managing the rental? If so, we'll need their contact information because, again, a buyer may want to get in touch with them and ask them questions about the lease and the tenant. FHA appraisal. Has there been an FHA appraisal done on the house in the past 4 months? Why 4 months? Because any FHA appraisal that's been done on a home sticks with that home for 4 months. So if you have a buyer on a house that does an FHA appraisal and they decide to terminate the contract, you have a new buyer coming along and they're also FHA. They're going to be using the same appraisal that original buyer used, because that FHA appraisal sticks with all FHA loans trying to purchase that home for 4 months. So if your seller has had an FHA appraisal in the past 4 months, we need to know about it because that appraisal is going to be used for any potential buyer in that 4-month time frame. Next is special assessments. Are there any special assessments, whether confirmed or proposed, from the HOA or on the property? If so, we need to know about those so we can make note of them and again disclose them. Fuel tanks and fuel. Is there any fuel tanks located on the property that would be supplying fuel for the heat, for whatever it may be supplying? Are there fuel tanks? If so, where are they? What is in them? Are they leased or owned? What are they used for? And again, what is in them? What type of fuel is in them? Are they above ground or below ground? Even if they are not used, if they have been just sitting there and never been used in 20 years, we still need to notate them and find out why they're not used. And if they have been deemed inoperable, have they been capped, sealed, filled, whatever needs to be done, has that been done so that way they are compliant with the the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. So we need to know about that. If they are being used, what is the refilling schedule? Is it automatically refilled, say, every 3 months? Is it refilled just when the seller calls? So that way we can relay all this information to the buyer. And when the refill does happen, how much does that refill cost? Are you paying by the gallon? Are you paying by there's a monthly fee you pay, then they just maintain it, whatever that may be. We need to know about that so we can let buyers know. All right. Next, the seller in the blue boxes. Seller is advised to consult with their fuel provider prior to selling the home. If the tank is leased, can we transfer that lease to the new buyer? Anything like that. Per the contract, the next blue box, there is a section in the contract about the fuel that goes into these tanks. Unless agreed upon, any excess fuel is supposed to stay with the home. Once the day before closing, unless it's agreed upon with the buyer, the seller cannot just have all that fuel removed and resell it back to the supplier. Any unused fuel is supposed to stay in the tank to the buyer. Next, off-site septic, boat slip, garage, parking space, or storage unit. Is any of those conveying with the home that would be off-site? Example of that is if you're selling a townhome or a condo. A lot of those communities may have a parking garage at the other end of the complex or a storage unit over by the office somewhere. Are those conveying with the sale of the home? If you live in a marina type neighborhood, is there a boat slip that is selling with the home? If so, we need to know about it so we can advertise it, because that could become very appealing to a buyer. Next, governmental compliance. Is the seller and the home in violation of any law, ordinance, permits, anything like that? Anything governmental related? Are they in violation of that? Are there any permits that have been pulled on the property that have not been finalized or approved? Any permit violations, ordinances, any of that? We need to know about that because those are what? Material facts, and we will have to disclose them. Relocation company. Is the seller working with the relocation company? Yes or no? That is very important because if they are, we may have to go through the relocation company with all of our paperwork, offers, contracts, anything like that. It is also possible, if they are working with a relocation company, that the relocation company may be, in essence, the seller for this transaction, depending on the relocation company's policies. So are they working with one? Yes or no? Next, seller's duties. This goes into the duties of the seller when trying to sell their home. They are going to have to fill out the appropriate property disclosures. The residential property owner and association disclosure statement, the mineral, oil, and gas rights disclosure. If the home was built prior to 78, they're going to have to fill out the lead-based paint addendum. If there's any other disclosures we have to fill out. Also, they're going to have to make the property available for showings. They are going to have to leave the utilities on through closing. They're going to have to maintain insurance on the property through closing. They're going to have to continue to make their mortgage payments, their HOA payments. They are going to have to continue to, keep up with their title insurance policies. Anything like that, they're going to have to maintain and keep current. So that way, just because they have their house under contract does not mean they need to quit paying their bills. Because what if that contract doesn't close? If they tell you, the closing is going to be before my next mortgage payment is due. Well, if it closes, then you won't have to make that mortgage payment. But if the closing gets delayed or doesn't close at all, you don't want to start falling behind. So make sure they know that. And then at time of closing, they're going to need to issue a general warranty deed, which states that the buyer is taking the home with no liens, no encumbrances, it's clean and free of any title issues. So the buyer's taking on a good, clean general warranty deed. If there is anything that prevents the seller from doing that, that is where these next lines would be filled in. Is there anything preventing the seller from issuing a general warranty deed to the buyer? If so, that's where we would write that in. If there is nothing, then you need to put NA. Just like any other line in this contract, if there's nothing to put either none or NA. You always want to put something in every line, so that way they're always filled out, and that way no one can go back at a later day and write something in. So just keep that in mind. All right, next, moving on down, home inspections. Does the seller want to get their home inspected prior to listing and selling their home? They can or they cannot. It's totally up to them. They may ask you, should I get my home inspected? Well, if they ask you, should I? Next question usually should be, well, why do you think you may want to get your home inspected? Is there a reason you may want an inspector to go through the home to address any or point out any issues that may be made known aware of? Because if there are, maybe we need to talk about that. We want to know, do they want it, yes or no? And if they do, we would do that within how many days of execution of this agreement? Does the seller want it done within 4 days of signing this? If so, we put in 4 days and make sure we get it done within 4 days. Next, photographs and other materials. So firm specifically is authorized to use any photographs or any other materials that we may take or are provided to us from the seller to market and sell their home. Now, any photographs that we take ourselves or we hire to list and sell the home, if the seller opts not to sell the home, this contract expires. All those photos are our photos. So the seller does not have rights to those once the listing agreement terminates because of either expiration or it terminates. Those photos are our photos. Now, we can sell those to the seller or whatever, but it is just known that if the seller decides not to sell the home, we get to keep our photos and stuff with us. Also, we want to make it known that if there are any photos or materials that are put out there to sell their home, if they are used maliciously by a third party, we will try our best to prevent that, but it is a possibility. And if we find it, we will do our best to get it taken down. But it is a possibility that a third party could have access to those photos from being on the internet, and they could be used maliciously. But we will try our best not to do that, or if it is, we will address it. Next, moving on, is dual agency. So this goes all the way in through page 11. Dual agency. Does the seller acknowledge dual agency? And what is dual agency? Dual agency, does the seller acknowledge and allow dual agency? If so, yes or no, what is it? So let's talk about it. Dual agency is where the seller will allow any agent at the listing firm to also represent the buyer in a transaction. Is the seller okay with letting anyone else in the listing firm bring a buyer? If they allow that, they allow dual agency. Now, designated dual agency is also in this. And do they allow designated dual agency? So the difference in dual agency and designated dual agency. Do they allow the list agent and anyone in the firm of the listing firm to bring that buyer? If they will allow that, but they do not allow the listing agent personally to bring the buyer, then they would want to practice designated dual agency. So that means they do not want their agent, that is also the listing agent, to also represent the buyer. So if we have a buyer that comes to our firm and our firm is allowed dual agency and they do not allow, and they want to practice designated dual agency, then we'll make sure as a firm, whoever represents that buyer does not intimately know the seller and material and information about the seller. So they are basically like, I'm losing my words here, but they're able to represent the buyer without knowing the seller's motivation. Yeah, without compromising the seller's negotiating tactics. So that way we'll keep that part separated. If the seller does not want to authorize dual agency, then they will check the initial on page 11, exclusive representation. If they do exclusive representation, that means no other agent in our firm can bring the buyer to this listing. So you want to make sure you go over that with your seller. If you do not allow dual agency, you are eliminating every other agent in this company to possibly find a buyer. All right. So on page 11, to cap that, the initial section, there's two sections. Do they authorize dual agency, or do they want exclusive representation and no dual agency? If they authorize dual agency, do they allow the same individual agent to represent the seller, the seller and buyer? And if they do not, then they will initial next to designated dual agency. Any questions about that? Oh. Termination, breach, mediation, and attorney fees. So termination. Seller understands that this is a bilateral contract. Not one party can just terminate. It takes two parties to terminate. But if the seller were to terminate or breach it, they understand that if that were to happen, the listing firm and listing agent could still be entitled to commission. Now, if it were to terminate or breach, we would try to negotiate some type of agreement to terminate this contract or go to a mediation before we go to arbitration and try to take it to court. So we agree, and the seller understands that we as a listing firm and a seller, if there is a breach or one party wants to terminate, we will try to come to a reasonable agreement to terminate this before basically trying to sue each other. But if it gets to that point, if it gets to arbitration and court, and we have to have attorneys involved, then it is also known that the prevailing party may go after the other party for those attorney fees within reason. So on page 12, that's where it talks about breach, mediation, and attorney fees. Last on page 12, big red box, wire fraud. Do not wire money to anybody as a seller unless it has been approved and confirmed with listing agent, attorney, or lender, and all parties above. There is very few cases where a seller will have to wire money prior to or at closing. But if that is the case, let your seller know before they do anything. We as a list agent will confirm that the wiring is correct, the amount is correct, and who it's going to is correct. Do not wire money unless we approve it. Because wire fraud is real in today's world. And we don't want our sellers sending their hard-earned money to someone just trying to steal it. Last page. This is the entire agreement. There is no side agreement, and any changes that are being made to this agreement will be acknowledged by all parties to this agreement. No changes can happen unless all parties sign off and agree to it. And then at the bottom, we have all of the sellers' contact information, their cell phone, their email address, their mailing address, their name, their signature, their date, and then at the bottom is the firm and the listing agent's contact information, address, phone number, email, license number, firm license number, and address. Once all parties have initialed every page and signed the last page, now we have a binding contract, a listing agreement that is complete. Anybody have any questions? Nope. Well, that is a listing agreement. We will next go over, not tonight, but the next one we will go over the disclosures that accompany the listing agreement, how to fill those out, what they mean, and all that. That'll be next. So I want to thank everybody for coming, listening. Hope this was beneficial. And then as you watch this later on, let me know what you think. And again, with our YouTube channel, please like and subscribe. Thank you.